The CityGen scene has gotten a little difficult to work with because it is hard to move the camera around while everything is being calculated, all the extrusion steps, and all of the different effectors on everything. The scene itself isn't very heavy. The amount of polygons in the scene, we right-click within the Object Manager and go to Scene Information. We can see that there are very few polygons in the scene, about 54,000 total, and that's hardly any at all. With a normal scene, we can have millions of polygons and not run into any trouble. So we've got a couple of different options we can do to be able to navigate the scene a little bit better and improve upon it. One choice that you have is to keep all of your clones for the render, but just have a new object to work with for planning any sort of camera animation or even just navigating around the scene to set up any sort of stills. So what we can do is right-click on the main cloner object and select Current State to Object. So this will take everything and turn it into one main null object. And what I'm going to do is hide the cloner object from the view so that we're just seeing these new baked objects. And we have the main cloner object, and all of the quad cloners, so everything it's cloning becomes a new null object. And within that null, we're also going to have all the individual buildings as separate objects. So all of the extrusion steps, all of the other effectors are now no longer applying to this object. And what we can do is just hide it from the render. So now what I'm going to do is just create a new camera to save that current position. And since the textures are no longer being affected by the distribution methods that were set up, they're going to appear exactly the same on every single object. So we can actually just remove all of those textures. And the color we're seeing is a modified display color for each of the cloner objects. And what it's done is taken the color from the cloner, the main cloner, and that randomization that was set up, and modified the display colors of the baked objects. And remember, that is per group of buildings and per quad cloner. But we can now navigate the scene, move around the camera much easier than before. In order to set up the shots. And although we can't see the textures, they wouldn't be correct anyway because they're not being distributed anymore because this is no longer a cloner. So this is one way to be able to just really kind of work with the clones, but still see everything in the scene and have it show up correctly at render time. So everything is working correctly, and now we just have two separate objects that we can use, one for the preview and one for the render. And it moves around and refreshes much quicker. Now the other option that we have is to perform a full bake of everything, including preserving all of the textures. And what we need to do is end up using another type of cloner in order to break apart the baked object. But we'll still have the flexibility of being able to move around and navigate the scene just as we do right now. But it does require a little bit more setup. And also, we won't be able to use the current object that I just set up for our preview because there are a few steps that need to be taken in order to preserve our polygon selection tags. Because otherwise there is a limit on how many tags will be carried over once this object is fully baked out into a single object. Just to show you what I'm talking about, if I copy this object in this cloner object null and create a new scene and paste it in, what I'm going to do is connect everything together. Now granted, we still have all of our polygon selection tags per object, so there is technically a way we could still preserve everything, but it will require expanding all of the quad cloners, selecting all the tags as one large selection, and then with all of them selected you can select polygons. But there is a better way with this method where we just have one tag per object that needs to be saved. And first, what I just want to show you what will happen if we use a connect object. Before I bring this into the connect object, I'm going to turn off weld. We can put that in there, and it might take a second to refresh. Hit C on the keyboard, it will make that connect object editable and bake that out. And what we're going to end up with is a huge list of polygon selection tags. Now this actually only carries over a limited amount of tags. Not every single tag is actually in there. If I do switch over to the polygon mode and select the object, what we're going to see is that the previous polygon that was selected for each individual object has been carried over. And that's sort of an internal selection. So what we can do is take advantage of that by selecting that top polygon of every object before we go ahead and bake it. And then we'll be able to create a new selection tag and get rid of all the other ones without having to select all of these at the same time and select polygons, which will actually only, in this case, take up about 3/4 of the objects, and the rest will remain without tags because there is a limit. So we can just delete this, go back to the other scene, and then we can also delete that other cloner. So we're going to expand the cloner and go into that quad cloner object, and we can actually just turn off the clones for the moment, switch to the polygon mode, and just select the top polygon of each object. Although we might need to hide the individual models to be able to see that top polygon. But it looks like I can pull out most of them. Otherwise we can switch over to the X-ray mode. In order to see it. So now it looks like all of the top polygons are just selected. So that will be remembered once we convert this over. Now, if you have set up that extrusion on top, as this object has the set of extrusions, so we can see the topper. Now, I don't have this on every object, just a couple of them. If I did have it on every object, once we have that polygon selection tag, we can grow the selection. In the polygon mode, go to selection and grow it, which will then start to select everything around the outer edge, and then we'll be able to select all of those new polygons that are created for that topper piece and create a new tag if you don't want to have the windows showing on that top section. So what I'll go ahead and do is actually just add the topper and make sure it's on every object so that you can see how that can be done. So I'm just going to copy and paste and drag that onto all of these. So now I can just close all the groups. We can turn back on the cloners. I'm going to switch to the model mode. And now I can right click current state to object. Now if we were to make this editable, what would happen, it would create groups of the cloner object. So we would have a null for this top cloner, and then these individual quad cloners would all have their own object, just as before we saw the null objects. Because render instances is turned off, if we had to render instances turned on, it will create instances. And instances can only be modified to a certain extent. I want to have all of this as one large object. So right click and go to current state to object. And that'll create the object we had before. And then what we can do is turn off the other cloner, hide it from the scene, just to preserve it for now. And we can even turn off the other set of cloners, just to make sure it's not turning on any or using up any resources. You can also turn off all the effectors for the moment. So we can take this cloner object, which I'll go ahead and just bring up all the way to the top, add in a connect object, make sure the connect object doesn't have weld turned on, just because I don't want to weld any points, and that operation will slow things down if it's trying to weld everything and calculate that. And now we can make this object editable. C on the keyboard or under functions, make editable. And we have one object. And we're still going to have all of those tags. So what I want to do is change over the view to vertical tags, just to make it a little easier to select all those polygon selections. Delete them because we don't need them. Turn off the vertical tag view. Select the object, switch to the polygon mode, and now we can see that all of those polygons were carried over. So now if we want that topper that was created to be selected as part of this top selection, well, first what I want to do is preserve this selection. So what we can do is set the selection. So now we have a new polygon selection that we can call top, which was the original top selection. And now if we want to expand upon that further, first I want to deselect that selection tag, because otherwise when we set the selection again, it will just overwrite whatever one is selected. And we can go up to selection, and we can grow the selection, which is also UW on the keyboard, which is what I'm going to continue to use. So UW again, grow the selection again, and then one more time. And then all of those toppers are now part of a new selection. So that way we'll make sure that there are no window textures showing on that portion of the building. Set the selection, and now we have something we can just call a topper. So top and then topper. So just the single polygon from the original selection that was used to extrude everything, and then the topper, which is now that set of selections from the top. switch over to the model mode, and we don't have any textures on this, so we need to take the textures from the cloner object. And actually, before we do that, since we don't have the MoGraph variations anymore, and you also see that the scene response to be able to move this around is just incredibly fast compared to what it was before, because, I mean, there just isn't that many polygons in the scene. If we go to the MoGraph menu, there's another type of cloner type object, which is the fracture object. We're going to turn this to explode segments. And what this will do is take any individual set of polygons that are not connected to other sets, and all the polygons that are connected to each other will become a new node or a new clone that we can modify. So then we're basically setting it back to a cloner object in a sense, and we can add the color effectors that we used to modify the textures once again. Now, what I did was drag the connect object into that fracture object, and my system's been unresponsive for quite a while now. And I've done this method before without any problems. What it's actually doing is breaking apart the individual groups and assigning basically them as a clone. It is taking quite a while for it to perform that action, and it's not that it's really unresponsive, it's just performing an action until that's complete. Now, because of this, it's actually going to be more effective to keep the object as clones and just use the baked object as the preview, unless you want to actually use the object and modify it. The only problem is that the textures are not going to be dynamically created or automatically created through MoGraph once it's baked. By using it as a fracture object, typically you can break it apart and then assign those color effectors to modify the textures that are on it. But right now it's taking so long to perform this action. I think what I'd like to do is approach this in another way, because this is probably going to be something that would work better for a smaller scale. And it might just be a fluke with this current scene, because I did perform it twice to see what would happen, and it is still processing the breaking apart of all of these different objects. It did actually complete it now, but once I tried to move the camera, it is once again unresponsive. So I'm going to say that this is not the best way, definitely, to perform this. So the fracture object should be used for smaller cases, or to pull out individual sections of buildings that you'd like to modify from the final. Okay, so I've gone back to a version where we just have a baked object, still with the selection tags. And what we can do is set the cloner to render, but not to show up in the scene for the moment. And if I still want to perform the action, or have so that the tops don't have windows on them, what I can do is take the object, so selecting this connect object with all of those top pieces selected, and what we can do is just remove and split. And now we have those as a separate object that will be run or rendered separately. So we will just need to add material for those top portions, and then we can go into the cloner and the individual cloners and remove the toppers. So just going through and removing all the extrusions from the topper, because now we're just going to use the geometry for those, and the actual geometry. So that's no longer going to be part of the cloner. So if we take a look just at a render, so now we can assign a new material to this. And whichever one is going to be our rendered, rename that toppers. We can call this other one building preview. And then we can take a material, we're going to take the buildings material, and we can apply that to the toppers so that it does have a texture. And then we can see that darker texture showing up. And we can still apply the top material, add that top selection tag, and that way it's basically where it was before, except without this one doesn't have the framework, and then we don't have the randomized color or randomized framework. But that way we don't have windows showing through on these top sections where we don't want windows. So what I'd like to do now is add elements to the tops of the buildings. This will require some sort of baked variation. Right now we have the tops separated. Well, if we had still the tops as part of the cloner object, we could still use the building preview to place objects on the top sections, just making sure that the elements render rather than the preview. And what we want to do is assign a cloner to the polygon selection for the tops. And that way we can add additional elements and make the buildings have more variation. So we could use even some of the objects or the objects themselves from the original buildings and the cloner. Whether or not you want to use the extrude deformers, that's up to you. What I'm going to do is select all of those objects from the main buildings, copy them, and paste them in, and just remove the extrusions for now. I would want to set up new extrusions if I was going to use them. In the MoGraph menu, I'm going to add in a cloner and then set it to the object mode. And the object is going to be the toppers object. The selection is going to be the top selection. And now we've got a couple of different modes we can choose from, depending on where we want to place the objects. The vertex mode will place all of our clones on the points, or around basically the edges, so each individual corner of the buildings. The edge mode will place it on the center of an edge, so slightly offset from the points. Polygon center, place it one clone in each center. Unless we have it on cluster mode, then we have every single object showing in the center. And we also have the ability to just select surface, which will allow us to set how many clones we want overall on that selection. So let's stick with surface for now and grab all these cubes, add them to the cloner object, and then it's going to place all of those on top and create our clones. Now the topper is currently hidden, so it might also hide our clones, or we just don't have enough. And it looks like we really just don't have enough objects. So let's increase that count to 1,000. So now we can start to see those objects showing up on the tops. They're way too large, and I also want to mention that the placement, or in other words the direction of the normal, is going to modify the placement of these objects, so they will be turned. And in order to get them to go upward, if you want them to be facing the same orientation as the buildings, you will need to use a modification on the pitch for the transform of the cloner to -90, and that will make them face upright. Otherwise, if you like them turned, because we do get some more variation that way, we could just leave it where it is, but we might need to modify the object axis in order to use them that way. So I'm going to set it to -90, and we want to change the scale of all of the objects. We don't want them to be so large. So we can reduce maybe 0.2, and just add small little elements to the tops of all of the buildings. We can also use some of the same deformers that we used to modify the buildings originally for the scale and things like that, whichever ones modify scale, in order to match up the scales a little closer to the building, just by taking the effectors and dragging them into the list for that cloner object. I am going to add the building's material to the cloner, and also the framework. And then we need to use the random placement, which is the Windows random, to the list of the cloner object effectors. And that will distribute the framework material. And then we can continue to increase the count and it will start covering the surface even more. So within the range of that polygon surface. In some cases you might have a few objects going over. That's going to be dependent on where the object axis is. So if you need to play around with some of those objects so that there are no overlaps, you'll need to modify the axis. So let's go ahead and set the count to 3,000, maybe 1,500. Let me take a look at a render. And now we'll start to see those objects as part of the scene. And then, just as we need to, we can increase that count to have even more objects showing up on the tops. And like I said, if you need to remove and you want more variation out of the object, you can remove that pitch, and that way they're turned sideways, so we'll have angles going in different directions if the original object has a slight angle to it. If you want to reverse the direction, you can use 180 degrees as the level of rotation for the pitch, just to flip them around. Or of course model new objects for this, which in a lot of cases will be better. For the objects that have an angle on the side, it will rotate the clone if you have fixed clone turned on. If we turn that off, it should turn off all of the rotations for the object, because otherwise it's going to be aligning them, or actually it is the aligned clone, sorry, not the fixed clone. So if we turn off align clone, Then anywhere where we have an angle, it will not rotate the object in the direction. Also, that transformation won't be needed, and the negative 90 will then turn it on its side. So there's a lot of different ways we can use it. I also want to mention that anything you want to put in the list for the cloner object to be on the top of the buildings, if you wanted to have antennas or any sort of towers, any communications equipment, anything, you could just add it to the list. If you wanted to add people or say helicopters or something like that, all you need to do is just add it to that list of cloners, and it will place it as part of the selection to be on top of the object.